You can be seated.
Shepherd King is our subject today. We're halfway through this study on David, and I appreciate many of your comments, and some of you have even dug into the scriptures and kind of read a little bit more. I appreciate that. And there's so much to learn about David. We've been studying his life. Hadn't become king yet so far, and it's been a wild ride to get to where he is. Today that's all going to change. He will become king, but not till the end of the message, so you can't leave yet, okay? The marks of maturity of someone like David, whether you're a king, a politician, a president, or a leader in some other area, one of the marks of maturity, I believe, is the fact that a leader is willing to give up something in order to benefit those who have chosen to follow him. And I'll just give you an example. Say what you will about our former President Trump, but and we could all do with $1.50 gas and a mean tweet right now. But one of the things that he did at the beginning of his presidency was he gave his salary back. He did not take a salary. And to me, that is the mark of a mature leader who is willing to give something up for those who have chosen to follow his leadership. And you and I both have probably very inspiring stories of people who've done that, who we've followed, maybe a boss or a coworker or even our parents, a coach, teacher, whatever it is. And that makes an impression on us, and we really like that. On the other hand, we don't like it, and there's probably nothing more appalling than a leader who takes advantage of his fellowship and does things for his benefit or her benefit rather than the benefit of those who follow. Would you agree? So we're going to look at David's life and how he got to this part to become one of the greatest leaders of Israel that they've ever known. But I want to start with this statement. All of us are leaders in some form or fashion. You may not consider yourself a leader, but whether you like it or not, leadership is influence. And you are influencing someone whether you realize it or not. You are a leader in some form or fashion. You may be leading in an organization. You may be leading a team. You may be leading a family. You may lead in the classroom. You may lead in the locker room. You may lead in the boardroom. But you are leading someone because you are influencing someone in some way. They are following your influence. They are looking to you, and you are influencing them. And again, I would say the greatest mark of maturity for us when we're given that responsibility is how do we respond to it? Do we do it for our benefit, or do we do it for the benefit of those who are following our leadership? So as we look at the life of David, he learned a very important lesson, and I think it's one that we all need to learn today. We're going to be jumping around in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and again, the narrative is so long, it takes up many, many chapters. We don't have time to read it all. I hope you do some reading on your own, but we're going to jump around, and there's this important truth that emerges from David's life that we can apply to our lives, and that truth is this. We as Christ followers should understand that it's not about us. It's about God's will, God's way, in God's timing. It's all about God's will, not about us, God's will, God's way, God's time. I want you to say those three little words with me. God's will, God's way, in God's time. David was on the run for 8 years, running, hiding, and all the time knowing that God had chosen him for something special. But he was learning an important lesson the whole time. He was learning this is not about me. This is about God's will, God's way, God's time. And you remember a couple of weeks ago, David had the opportunity in the cave to kill Saul and claim the throne. But it wasn't God's will, it wasn't God's way, and it certainly wasn't in God's time. So we're going to skip around through some of these verses and look at David's journey to becoming the shepherd king. And what we have to do is we have to start by going back to when David was just a boy. Samuel was the prophet. He was the authority at the time, the spiritual authority other than King Saul. And Samuel showed up at David's home one day, but David wasn't there. And this is what he said to David's father. He said, Jesse, I'm here on a mission, and we'll discover later that it was a secret mission. And the reason that it was a secret mission was because Samuel's mission was to anoint the next king of Israel. And the reason it was secret was because Israel already had a king. It was King Saul. So if you're going to anoint the next king and there's already a king, you better keep the mission a secret. And that's what he did. He shows up and he doesn't even tell Jesse why he's there. So we're going to start reading in 1 Samuel 16. And this is such a fascinating story. Beginning in verse 1, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. But Samuel said, well, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. And verse 4 says, Samuel did what the Lord said. And when he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him, and they asked, do you come in peace? And the reason they trembled and asked that question was when a real true prophet came into town, and if it was not good, it could be really bad for everybody. So they were a little scared of Samuel, but Samuel replied, yes, in peace, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves, come to the sacrifice with me. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And the idea was this, that Samuel thought, as soon as I see the son of Jesse that I'm supposed to anoint king, then God is going to give me a nod or something. I'm going to get a God wink or whatever. He's going to show me that this is the next king, and I'll know what to do. So Jesse invites all of his family to this special sacrifice, and Samuel's kind of scanning the crowd to figure out which one of these sons is going to be the next king. And the text says this in verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Eliab was the firstborn. And Samuel thought, this is easy. Firstborn, first kid. We don't even have to do the sacrifice. Game over. I got this figured out. But that's not what happened. Verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height. And that's a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? When you meet somebody, the first thing you notice is what? It's not their IQ. It's what they look like, right? It's not their manners. The first thing you notice is the way a person looks. When Osvaldo walks into the room, you see how tall he is. You notice that. The first thing you notice is the way a person looks. And all of us, even in ancient times, we ascribe value and influence to people who look good. And God says, Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Why? Because we learned something important here, and here's what it says. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. In other words, it's what's in a man that makes a man. So ladies, don't be fooled by an outward appearance. It's what's in a woman that makes the woman. So men, never mind, you're hopeless anyway. But the story goes on. It says, then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. 7 sons and still no king. I mean, all the sons are there. They're starting to do the sacrifice, and Samuel's looking around like, maybe I missed something. And then verse 11, he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? Well, there is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. And Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. I hope he wasn't far away. So he sent for him and had him brought in, and he was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. And then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. And we don't have time to read it all, but this strange thing happens where Samuel walks over to middle school David, and he pours oil on his head, and he gives him a blessing, and then he just packs up his stuff and leaves. And the whole family's standing there like, what just happened? Because there's no indication in the text that Samuel was anointing him to be king. He didn't tell anybody that. So they're going, what just happened? But here's what we know. Write this down. God's will was for David to become king. God's will was for David to become king. God's will, God's way, in God's time. And ever since he was a little boy, ever since he was a middle schooler, David knew that God had something special for him. And it was about 2 years from this moment that he kills Goliath. And he becomes an overnight sensation. And then for the next 7 years, David is in the good graces of the kingdom. King Saul offers him one of his daughters in marriage. We talked about that a few weeks ago. He becomes best friends with Saul's son Jonathan, who is in line to be the next king. And for 7 years, things are great. And then, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, Saul gets threatened. He gets jealous. And he tries to kill David. He puts a bounty on his head. And David becomes a fugitive for the next 8 years. So for the next 8 years, David is on the run, hiding with his band of men, trying not to side with the Philistines, but at the same time trying to stay away from King Saul and everyone who supports King Saul, all the while knowing that God has chosen him for something special. And all the while, if you read through this incredible detailed narrative, all the while learning some extraordinarily important lessons. And perhaps the most important lesson that David learned in the wilderness was this lesson. It's not about me. It's about God's will, God's way, in God's time. Say it with me. God's will, God's way, in God's time. And the interesting thing, too, and the narrative is just so fascinating. On 2 occasions, and you know one of these because we already talked about it, but on 2 occasions, David has an opportunity to kill King Saul. One of them is that famous occasion where David is in the back of the cave. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. But I want to show you the other one, and it's in 1 Samuel 26. This story isn't as popular as the first one, but sometime later, Saul and his army they're in the desert of Ziph, and it's just a wide open plain with rolling hills and hardly any trees. And David has sent spies to track Saul's progress. He always wanted to know where Saul was so he could stay a step ahead of him. And this report comes back that they're in the desert of Ziph, and they're camped out for the night. And David just can't resist. He decides to take a group of men up over a hill to watch the camp where Saul and his army are sleeping. Now look at verse 5 in this passage. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, and Abner was Saul's main guy. He was the bodyguard, so to speak. The commander of the army had lain down. Saul was lying beside the camp, and the army encamped around him. So if you can visualize this, the sun goes down. King Saul does what all kings do. He decides to spend the night right in the middle of his army. So he is surrounded, completely surrounded by about 3,000 men. He's right there in the middle of them. He's laying down, and as kings did, his spear was in the ground right by his head, so that when the time came, if he needed it, he could get it. Look at what happens. David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, who will go down into the camp with me to Saul? Now David gets this harebrained idea that he's going to sneak into Saul's camp while he's asleep. Now I don't know what he was planning to do, because the last time he sneaked up on Saul, he changed his mind and cut the robe instead of the throat. I don't know what David's up to, but at any rate, he gets a volunteer. I'll go with you, said Abishai. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. And Abishai said to David, and this takes you back to the cave again, today, God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now, let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. In other words, David, we missed this opportunity once. Now's the time to power up. Now's the time to take what's yours. This is God's will for you to be king. How else can we explain the fact that we have walked into Saul's camp undetected by his entire army? No one's detected us. And I know, David, you're all freaked out over the fact that he's king, but hey, let me kill him, and I won't mangle the body. It'll just take one thrust, and I'll go right through the heart. His eyes will be wide open, and the last thing he'll see is your face. And the whole army will wake up, and I guarantee you they will declare you king. Verse 9, David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Listen, this is so big for us. I refuse, David says, to violate the will of God to gain the blessing of God. I will not violate the will of God to gain the promise of God. I'm not going to violate the will of God to get what I know is coming, that I deserve. This is not about me. This is about God's will, God's way, in God's time. Now, it was God's will for David to become king, but God's way meant that David must refuse to take matters into his own hands. David refused to violate the will of God to gain the promise of God. David refused to replace what God had already put in place. Now, I would encourage you on your own to read these verses later, because David has a little bit of fun with the situation. He takes Saul's spear and he takes his water jar as well, and he and Abishai go back to the men on the camp up on the hill, and they shout out and they wake everybody up, and to let them know, hey, we were right there in the middle of you, and we didn't do anything. And David actually makes fun of Abner, the bodyguard, not doing his job. And you can read all that later. But he left the spear. His men melt into the desert. And eventually, and I'm skipping a lot, eventually King Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle. Now, the two men that stood in the way of David becoming the king was Saul and Jonathan. And the interesting thing is the text tells us that David actually mourned the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. The two men, the only two who were obstacles and stood in the way of him becoming king. When they died, instead of throwing a party, he mourned their deaths. And when they died, the tribe of Judah, Israel had 12 tribes. The tribe of Judah, which was the tribe David was from, they declare him king. So he's king, but really he's not king of everything. He's only king of his one tribe. There are 11 other tribes. And it just so happens that a fellow named Ishbosheth, say that 3 times really fast, Ishbosheth, who was one of Saul's sons, he was actually the 4th son, he declared himself to be king over the other 11 tribes. David is now king over one tribe. Ishbosheth is king over the other 11 tribes. And for, listen, 7 more years, there is conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul. And then eventually, throughout this conflict, David just kind of, essentially, he tries to stay out of the way. And people continually say to him, claim what's yours, David. Claim what's yours. Over and over. But David says, no. It's help me out. God's will, God's way, in God's time. I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. And if Ishbosheth has been declared king by the other tribes, then he's king. I just need to stay out of his way. 7 years this goes on. And then finally, again, I'm skipping a lot. You can read it later. But finally, 2 of Ishbosheth's own henchmen in his own group, they sneak into Ishbosheth's house while he's taking a nap, and they murder him in his sleep. And they think they've done a great thing for David because now, think about this, they have removed the last obstacle for David to be able to be king over the entire nation of Israel. So they cut off Ishbosheth's head, and they take it to David to give him the good news. The last obstacle has been removed. Now, let me just stop and say something about beheadings. This is interesting, and you can probably use this somewhere, okay? But in the Old Testament, it's full of beheadings. And in fact, all of ancient times were full of beheadings. And when we read these stories, we think how gory that was and how gruesome. But here's why they beheaded people. There is a reason. They didn't have smartphones. And by that I mean they didn't have a camera. So they could not prove that a person was dead. So what they did was they cut off his head. Because who wants to, drag a dead body around when you can just take the head and show the head and prove that that person is dead? So the way to prove that Ishbosheth was in fact dead was to take his head to David. Now you've learned something. You can use that somewhere, maybe in Trivial Pursuit, who knows. But I tell you this, David wasn't happy about it. He said, you've killed an innocent man. And they said, how can you say he's innocent? He was claiming the kingdom that belongs to you. But in David's mind, that's not how he thought. He thought God's will, God's way, God's time. And David had those 2 men executed, and he took the head of Ishbosheth and he buried it, which was a sign of honor. He buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Well, after Ishbosheth was dead, after his demise, the other 11 tribes finally declared for David to be king. Let's just give them all a hand, right? Finally, he's king. After being a fugitive for 8 years, after being at war with the house of Saul for 7 more years. This is what we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5. Look at it. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns." In other words, David, we all know that you had the influence. We all know who had the power. We all know who deserved to be king. And the Lord said to you, "You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." Now, it was not a mystery to these people. They just couldn't understand why he didn't claim it. They knew he was destined to be king. They just didn't know why he didn't seize the throne when he had so many opportunities. Now think about this. They're about to hand him the power. He's holding all the cards. His word is law. He already has the influence. He already is the most important person in the room, even without the crown. But in this moment, the text tells us that King David made a covenant with the people in Hebron. I want you to see it in verse 3. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Now, a covenant, in our way of thinking, is like a contract. A covenant in this context is, I will do this if you will do this. And if you will do this, I will do this. It was an arrangement. It was an agreement that King David made, making promises to the people. And it was completely unnecessary. He didn't have to. He didn't need to do this. He was the king. His word was law. Why in the world, after being mistreated after all those years, and again, he's facing a group of elders who rejected him as king earlier, the other 11 tribes. He could have exacted vengeance on every single one of those elders, except for those who were of the tribe of Judah. But he didn't. Instead, he makes this covenant with the people. And here's what I want you to see. He did this because God's time taught David to leverage his influence for the benefit of those under his influence. In this moment, David recognized in public that he would be a king, but he would be a king under authority. In this moment, he submitted himself to God's law, which meant as a leader, he was submitting himself to the people over which he would rule. And that was his way of saying, I am a king, but I am not the king. And when all the elders of Israel from all 12 tribes and all the elders of Israel come together to King David at Hebron to crown him, the power, the influence, the crown, in this moment, David shows his true greatness. And in this moment, he applies everything that he's been learning in the wilderness. And he shows extraordinary maturity that he would not have had at 15 or 20 or, as we saw, certainly not at 22. But the difficult lessons he'd learned hiding and running from King Saul, in this moment he would apply them and show his greatness. And this is why David is the shepherd king. Look again at verse 2. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. Now, I don't think I have to explain to you what a shepherd is, right? You know what a shepherd is. What does a shepherd do? Takes care of sheep. He watches them, he protects them, he makes sure that their needs are met. See, he's a shepherd, but he's also the ruler. He's the king. He is the shepherd king. And later on in Psalm 23, David would write, the Lord is my shepherd, meaning to say, I am a shepherd, but I'm not the shepherd. He knew that he was a king. He was never going to be confused being a king with being the king. He understood that it wasn't about him. It was about God's will, God's way, in God's time. Now, how does this apply to you? Well, God has a plan and a purpose for your life, but he also has a plan and a purpose for your influence. Leadership is influence, as I said at the beginning. And you may not consider yourself to be a leader like David, but it doesn't matter. You are some kind of leader by default because you have influence with someone. And as we learn from David, we are to leverage our influence for the benefit of those who are under our influence. How do we do that? Well, we learn from the example of another shepherd king. His name, Jesus. Because here's the thing. This whole story of David is an inspiring story. But it is really not enough for us to be inspired, is it? If you're a Christ follower, this kind of leading is required. Whenever we watch someone do the right thing, whenever we see a leader say no to themselves to say yes to the people they're leading, it's always inspiring, isn't it? But for the Christ follower, if you're a Christian, it's not enough for us to be inspired. That kind of greatness is required. And here's why I say that. 1,000 years later, if you can imagine this, it's hard to imagine. 1,000 years later, 20 miles north of Hebron, where all this took place, in the city of Jerusalem, Jesus would model this greatness in the most unusual way, and there would be a twist. I want to read it to you. The verses are in John 13, and here's what it says. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. See, Jesus knew it was God's will for him to sacrifice his life for the sins of the world. He knew it had to be done God's way, even though he prayed for a different way. And he knew now, as we read, that it was God's time. The time had come. Now look at what he does in verse 4. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, here's the question. What do you do when you're king? What do you do when you're the most powerful, influential person in the room? What do you do when you have the whole world in your hands? John says he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and starts to wash feet. The disciples, they couldn't believe it. I mean, there's so much emotion in this room, and when they see what's happening, there's like this moan or a groan, and Peter speaks up and says, no, you're not going to wash my feet, Jesus. We have servants for that. We have people for that. You're a rabbi. You're a teacher. You're the most important person in the room. And Jesus just smiled and ignored all of them. And then in verse 12, it says, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. But now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done to you. And in a nutshell, I think if you're a Jesus follower, he's saying to you, in those moments when you think you're something, and when those moments when you think you're somebody and someone hands you the keys, or someone shows you to the corner office, or someone puts a crown on your head, or someone gives you the opportunity of a lifetime, in that moment, look for more feet to wash. Because that's what a shepherd king does. And perhaps the thing that says more about our maturity than anything else is that when we do have the authority and when we do have the influence, how do we respond to that? How do we deal with that? And let's be honest, at some level, at some capacity, somebody's already handed you the keys, haven't they? Somebody has given you a title. For somebody, you're a crown. You're a father, you're a mother, you're a husband, you're a wife, you're a manager, you're a boss, you're an owner, you're a captain of the team. Maybe you're just the big brother or the big sister. You're the president, board member, scheduler, admin assistant. It doesn't matter what you are, you have influence. And we would do well to embrace the greatness that David learned the hard way and that Jesus modeled for us in his last hours of life. That when you're the most powerful person in the room, leverage your power on the benefit for the other people in the room. This is what David learned in the desert. This is what Jesus modeled for us. Don't you wish the leaders of our nation would do this? And if you're a Christian, it's required of you and me. Because after all, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, imagine if all of us lived this way. And what happened in that upper room 2,000 years ago changed the world once. I believe it can change it again. But we all have to take our influence in whatever position that is and leverage it for the benefit of those who are following us. Look for more feet to wash. Would you pray with me? Every head bowed and every eye closed. And I don't know where you are on this. Maybe God has spoken to you in some way. Maybe you just didn't realize that you were a leader, that someone's following you. But I want you to just ask yourself the question, what would it look like for me to do this? What does it look like for me to take whatever influence I have in whatever position I'm in, whether it be the boardroom or the living room? How do I influence that for those who are following me? How do I use it for the benefit of those who are under my employment? How do I do that for those that are on my team? How do I do that for those in my family? Jesus says, look for feet to wash. So you can pray and ask God right now what that looks like for you. Father, I thank you so much for the example that we learned from David today and from you yourself. Shepherd kings who are willing to lay down their lives for the people who followed them. So, Father, you're asking us to do the very same thing. In fact, you're requiring it of us. That when we have influence, we must leverage it. We must wash feet. We must take care of those who are looking to us to lead. Show us what that looks like, Father, in our world and wherever we have that influence. If there's anyone here today who's never established a relationship with you, that they would realize that what you did that night in the upper room was all in preparation for giving your life on a cross. It was your will for your Son to die, to forgive us of our sins. It had to be done your way and in your timing. And so, God, if there's anyone here who needs to accept that into their lives, to receive forgiveness for sin, to understand that you did create them with purpose and with influence, and as they follow you, it becomes more clear, and then eternity that comes with it. God, may they accept you and receive you into their life today. And so as we leave this place, Father, help us to look for more feet to wash. We ask this in Jesus' name.